Basically, this interview will go for about half an hour, 40 minutes. We will be posting the footage. We're recording it through Zoom, and we'll be posting the footage on probably Facebook and YouTube. I'm not sure if you're super familiar with the way that Honi Soit kind of covers political elections, but it'll basically just be some analysis posted in our next edition. And then we have the quiz on Friday, which, are you able to make that?
Yeah, that's all good.
Okay. All right, so let's get started then. Everything's set up. So because we're posting this online, lots of people might not have heard of your campaign before. So let's just start off with some basics. What's your name, degree year, campaign color, and slogan?
So my name is Ben Hines. I'm in the third year of a combined Bachelor of Commerce and Bachelor of Laws degree, majoring in finance. My campaign color is a turquoise, with my slogan being, I'm backing Ben.
Cool. And who's your campaign manager?
My campaign manager is Alex D'Arujo.
All right.
Groovy. So are you in a political party?
I am a member of the Liberal Party outside of this election, but I am running as an independent.
Great. And are you a member of a campus faction?
Not necessarily, no. I am part of the Sydney University Liberal Club, but I don't necessarily subscribe to the whole factional thing.
Okay, cool. Have you campaigned for any candidates in previous elections or run in any previous elections?
So I did campaign manage for the satirical ticket. If you notice, the SRC privatized the SRC, but I've never formally actually run for anything or sort of got involved.
Okay. Well, with that being said, why are you running for USU Board?
I think there are a few reasons why I'm running this year. I'd probably say, well, three main ones. The first one is kind of, your generic answer that I'm assuming you're going to get from most candidates, which is obviously the USU has played a major part in my university experience through providing things like clubs and societies, through providing things like, facilities like Courtyard. And I think that's really enabled me to get the most out of university. It's where I've made most of my good friends in university. And when I look back on university and what I've enjoyed and what I've kind of got the most out of, it hasn't been studying in Fisher Library. It's sort of been all of those things the USU has provided. And I think kind of like everyone I assume will have, I have that sort of desire to give back in some way and to sort of make sure that those sort of things are available for people into the future. I'd also say that in kind of a smaller and more personal level, I think being a board director would be something that I would just genuinely really enjoy. I think the sort of responsibilities and actions involved with that are something that I would be able to sort of enjoy, like I said, and put a lot of effort and time into without seeing as being a burden. And I think alongside sort of giving back, that's always going to be a good thing. And I think thirdly, I would say that this is kind of a really important time for the union. I think noticing things like the coronavirus pandemic, which is kind of unprecedented in its scope, and we're not really sure how that's going to affect things like the union. I think this is a really important time to have sort of strong policy positions and strong management. And I think that I would be able to do that quite well, given sort of my financial commerce sort of background and experience. And I think that making sure the union is strong into the future is something that I really want to make sure is available for all students, and therefore was something that I thought made me want to run this year.
Okay. Well, what makes you better placed than some of the other candidates running, or what makes you kind of stand out from the pack? Why should students vote for you?
So I think there are two main areas in which I would kind of differentiate myself from other candidates. I think a lot of the other candidates are really well placed as well, but I think I would stand out in two main ways. I would say firstly, the kind of nature of my clubs and society experience, and secondly, like I said, kind of my financial background and experience there. So on that first kind of idea of clubs and society experience, I think I have the benefit of not only sort of depth of experience. So I know other candidates might have, for example, high up positions. Whilst I have that sort of position in some societies, I've also had lower down positions in numerous different societies. So working my way up the entire sort of line there kind of shows different things that need to be considered by different positions in societies. And I think that's always important to consider in USU decisions in that manner. But I also think I have kind of a width of experience as well. So I think rather than just having that experience in one society or one sort of type of society, I've kind of managed to get involved across a wide range. So different types of societies in different sort of positions as well. And I think what that kind of would allow in my sort of, if I was lucky enough to be elected USU position, would be sort of being able to consider things that affect a lot of different types of people and stakeholders, rather than just sort of one specific type and furthering one specific set of interests. And I think that's always going to be important. So that's sort of what I think my clubs and societies experience does for me. In terms of my other background, I think, like I said, the USU, whilst it doesn't run as a for-profit organization, obviously its sort of financial situation is sort of intrinsically linked to how well it's going to provide services and provide things for people. And I think, therefore, it's going to be important to make sure that whilst not necessarily turning a profit or an operating contribution, I think it's important that there's some stability there, because whilst the union needs to be sort of putting money into things, especially in this period, it needs to make sure that it's sustainable in doing so. So I think making sure that sort of those decisions are made in the best interests of the union and students kind of will be benefited by my knowledge of things to do with finance and to do with sort of financial management.
Okay, cool.
So which candidates are your top 2 favorites and which candidate is your least favorite? Or, because we've had like a couple of issues with people kind of wanting to answer this question, which 2 would you say you're like more compatible with, and like who do you think you're maybe less compatible with ideologically or otherwise?
So I've spoken to a lot of the candidates, and I think a lot of them are really good. I think in terms of if I had to pick 2 of them, it would be quite hard. I would say, firstly, I think having spoken a lot to Nick, we get along quite well on sort of a lot of policy positions and a lot of ideas for what we think the union should look like in the future. And I think we have a lot of sort of the same ideas in that sense. And I think we get along quite well and we'll be able to work together quite well as well. I also think that having had discussions with a lot of the independents, a lot of those people have a lot of similar ideas as well, but I think it might be a little bit unfair to single out 1 or 2. So I would also say maybe Belinda. I've spoken to Belinda quite a lot as well, and we have a lot of similar ideas and similar values. And I think, I think they'd be really fun to work with those sort of people. In terms of who I would think I would be least likely to work with, I think that's, like you said, a bit of a difficult question. I would probably say some of the candidates that I haven't had a chance to talk to yet, just because we haven't had that discussion over what we think sort of is important in this union race. So I would say, whilst I would be incredibly willing to work with anybody if I was lucky enough to be elected or even beforehand in the election, I think just insofar as I haven't been able to talk to, I think it's Ruby and Prudence at the moment. I think obviously there might be some issues in terms of getting to know each other at the start that might sort of hinder that a little bit. Not that I wouldn't be willing to work with them at all, though.
Cool. So if you had to cut $1 million from the USU's budget, where would you cut it from?
I think it's probably a little bit myopic to say one specific area. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, preferably.
Okay.
I mean, you can answer the question however you wish, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think my intuitive answer would be to say I wouldn't cut $1 million from any one specific area, because considering like the revenue of the USU is like $31 million, and then your costs are like a portion sort of proportionately to that, $1 million is probably going to be like a very substantial area. So I would preferably want to, like, if I was having to cut $1 million, go through different programs and maybe sort of reduce the spending individually on different levels depending on the nature of that funding. I think if it was going to have to be from one sort of area, I would probably certainly avoid the things that directly impact student experiences. So I think things such as clubs and societies probably should be left to their funding. I would probably aim to things that are more like marketing or sort of that sort of area. I think insofar as whilst they're important for furthering the union, they could probably be wound back slightly without having a huge impact on sort of student experience in the short term.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about obviously the unprecedented times we're in and how the USU is facing what seems like a pretty precarious financial situation at the moment. Do you think that the staff at the USU needed to be stood down recently as a result of the decrease in money coming in, or do you think there could have been an alternative solution?
So I think that issue was obviously one that was quite sort of hard to deal with. And I think Connor's statement put it quite well on saying that the decision wasn't one that was obviously like the first hope, but it was kind of one that was required. I think in that a lot of the positions the USU sort of had to stand down, there's the potential for government subsidies such as JobKeeper. I think that was going to make it probably less of a hard decision to do so. I think ultimately, I would have to look a bit more at like this year's financial statements. I know they haven't really been released properly yet. I think, unfortunately, because so much of the USU's revenue comes from on-campus operations, you're going to have to scale back in some sense. And looking at past financial statements, wages and employment benefits are a incredibly large sort of cost for the USU. So I think that's probably not something that was going to be sustainable without that revenue per se, considering the costs were in the multiple millions. I think then you have to look at the alternatives of what you can do. And I think the USU applying for things like JobKeeper to make sure that there is some support for those people was going to be a good thing. I think ultimately, to answer your question a bit more directly, I think temporarily standing down people was probably the only way the union could have gone. But that said, I think I support the union's decision and would probably try and go further in providing support apparatus and sort of structures to make sure those people in the short term, when they're not employed by the USU, have some other alternative or other potential ways to get employment. And I think potentially things like guaranteeing them the opportunity to have those jobs back as soon as like on-campus operations resume would have been a good way to go as well.
Okay. And principally speaking, do you think that CEO, heads of department and board directors should take a pay cut during this time?
During this time, principally speaking, I wouldn't necessarily be against it. I think you'd have to kind of look more specifically into the situations at hand. But I think if you're going to be having dramatically reduced responsibilities for those people, reduce things like that, then it's possibly something I would be considering looking into if I was to make that decision. I think another thing that's important to note is I think maybe reductions to things like other benefits board directors get. So I know obviously like the daily lunch allowances, I think things like that are probably less important in a time like this, not that they're probably being claimed anyway. I think there is some sort of scope to maybe reduce the salaries of those people as well. I think I would probably have to look into it a bit more though, in terms of like how they would be affected directly by that, considering they are still sort of providing the key services they need to be doing, things like board meetings, etc.
Okay.
Cool. Do you think that the free access that was introduced last year is still viable given the USU's current financial state?
So I think what was quite good about free access was that like it was at least in part funded by the university. And I think the university, whilst obviously there are some hits as a result of the pandemic, is in a much better financial position to be able to continue to provide that into the future. So I think as long as the USU can sort of get that commitment to funding again, which I think sort of was being in the works, or if not sort of tentatively verbally confirmed, if they can get that sort of base of funding, I think there is always going to be a much more like a greater likelihood it's possible. I think in terms of providing it into the future, I think it's something that the USU should definitely prioritize or try and work around to make sure it is viable. Again, I think it probably requires a bit more analysis of this year's financial statements as to the costs associated with that, to make like a final decision, and something that would probably be better placed by someone with access to like that confidential financial information that the board has. But I think I would definitely, if elected, make it like a priority to try and do everything to make sure that it was viable if it wasn't already.
Cool. And I guess just kind of continuing on with the union's relationship with the university, with the USU in a precarious financial situation, as we've already covered, would you support or stand against a university takeover of the union?
I would definitely stand against that. I think the independence of the USU is kind of central to its function. I think the fact that the USU should be sort of, like I said in my policy statement, for students and by students, I think it's important that it maintains some autonomy to be able to like accurately represent student interests and be able to sort of advocate for them. I think whilst the university and the USU, the working relationship between the two is incredibly important to enable that, I think like having the university take over the union kind of will directly undermine sort of its purposes and its ability to best kind of carry those out. So I would be against it.
Okay. We had a conversation not long ago with Nick Rigby, and he basically told us that he thought that politics really had no role in the USU. What's your kind of stance on the USU taking a political stance?
When you say political stance, do you mean like, for example, the Ramsey Center thing, or do you mean like factions running candidates?
That can be an example, yes. So do you think the USU should take a stance on how the university is acting or on external issues?
Yeah, so I think the USU, I think it should. I think that's probably a sort of divergence from other candidates and maybe from Nick as well. But I think the USU, should be taking these stances. And I think that's true for a number of reasons. I think it's true, firstly, because I think the demarcation or like the distinguishment between the SRC as purely activist and the USU as sort of purely providing services is somewhat artificial and not always helpful. I think the USU has incredible sway within the university. I think the USU inherently represents students and their interests. And I think on certain issues, it's well placed to sort of voice the concerns of the student body. I think it should probably not be doing so to the extent of the SRC. So the SRC obviously comments on a whole wide range of issues and is incredibly activist. I don't think that's the role of the USU. But what I think the USU can and probably should be doing is taking stances on things. So I think, for example, the Ramsey Center letter that Maya and Nick made last year, I was actually quite supportive of that, because firstly, I thought that with the amendments made in the meeting, it was quite balanced and quite like a fair assessment. But I secondly thought that it was something that was always going to like incredibly impact student interest and the student experience at university. So the USU is kind of inherently involved with that. So I thought that there was always some place to have that stance taken. What I don't necessarily think is the USU's role in taking those stances is imparting or furthering certain specific ideologies over other ones. What I think it should be doing is taking certain values or certain ideas and pragmatically applying them to other situations to sort of take a stance that's in the interests of students. I think that doesn't necessarily have to be political in the sense that some people might term it, but I think taking those stances is always going to be a good thing. And I think it's something the union should be doing.
Okay, with that being said, do you think the university should be, or do you think the USU should be taking a specific stance against the university, or, you know, regardless, for or against the university in terms of how they're supporting students during COVID? Or what do you think that stance should be that the USU is taking?
So I think the USU obviously should be taking some stances with regards to how the university is dealing with this pandemic. Whether or not that looks like actively sort of undermining or speaking for or against university policy, I'm undecided depending on what the policy is. So for example, I think there's like a large student movement currently against the use of ProctorU. And I think the SRC has been heavily involved in that, but I think the USU could, for example, reflect the views of students, maybe do a bit more consultation to make sure that it is like a wide ranging sort of view. But I think when there's like things like that, which have major sort of effects on students, major privacy concerns associated, the USU could, noting its sort of like sway within the university, put that to good use and try and stand up for students on behalf of students. I think because those things are always going, like response to coronavirus is always going to be something that like affects the student experience, which is probably something I would associate as like a concept with the USU as student experience university. I think the USU should be taking stands for things like that and potentially making sure that it is on behalf of the majority of students. Things like taking a stance against ProctorU is going to be a good thing. What I also think the USU has sort of the scope to be doing is assisting / aiding the university in providing specific services such as mental health support. So things like CAPS would be providing. I think it could go further and sort of provide its own things on top of what the university is doing. I think my first section of my policy statement deals with this pretty comprehensively. Things like providing support for transitioning online. I think all of these things that kind of may not necessarily be the focus of the university because the university has to deal with like all of those logistics. I think the USU is quite well placed and quite sort of involved in doing. I think they could take stances on that. And I think they could be doing practical things to be helping students as well.
Cool.
Okay.
So just kind of moving into more kind of board focused questions.
Yep.
What is your opinion on how successful the current board has been? And what is your opinion specifically on Connor Werett's presidency?
Yeah. So I think this current board has obviously had sort of, I guess you could kind of split it into like pre-coronavirus and sort of since coronavirus happened sort of period. I think this board has been quite successful looking at the policies it's implemented and sort of kept going. I know it's been like responsible for dealing with the ongoing sort of support with the whole free access system. I think that's been done incredibly well and making sure that that continues to be viable into the future. I think this year the board did incredibly well with Welcome Fest. Obviously being like the largest one it has in history, I think the board did an amazing job sort of getting that all set up, obviously consulting a lot with Dane, who was running that. I think they did a great job there. I think the board has also done good job on things, like I said earlier, with taking stances like the Ramsey Center stance. Whether or not people agree with the stance itself, I think the move towards doing things like that by people like Maya have been incredibly strong. I also think the board has been doing good things in its most recent meeting, for example, where I think it was Benny Shen brought up potentially like considering the effect of like people who have paid for access rewards going forward. I think the board has obviously been well engaged and well informed and sort of well reasoned on dealing with those issues. So I think what the board has done in those areas in policy terms has been all quite strong. Moving more so onto like optics, and that will lead on to Connor, I think they've also been doing a great job there. I think when you kind of go around university, go around Courtyard, go around Welcome Fest, it'd be hard to miss at least one person with that like USU lanyard who you know as a board director, sort of getting out there and being the face of the USU board and interacting with people. And I think that's sort of had a really good effect on people being more engaged. I think Connor has been the head of that. And I actually think Connor has done a really good job about the USU. I think Connor is always so happy to talk about the union. He's so happy to sort of tell you everything that's great about it and be the face of that union and sort of spread the word to everybody. He's incredibly enthusiastic about his job, and I think that's sort of spread to a lot of people. And I think, honestly, in some way, I think the extent to which he's been like enthused by it and involved with it was like one of the reasons that sort of pushed me a little bit more to want to run, because I think that kind of made it seem to be like an inclusive sort of university experience for everybody. And I think the board and Connor himself have sort of embodied that and sort of pushed that idea to everybody, that the union can be something for everybody, something that can sort of impart that great social experience to everybody. So I think, yeah, on the whole, the board has done quite a good job.
Cool. And what would you say the board's biggest weakness is, if you could identify one?
The biggest weakness, so I would say, I think going back slightly, the issues that were like held over consultation with clubs and society executives. I know this was probably more so a bit more relevant at the start of last year, but I still think it could be a little bit relevant now, is that a lot of decisions don't necessarily seem to be made with like wide-ranging consultation to a whole group of different people and a whole group of like different impacted stakeholders. I think what could be done more, especially for things like funding changes that happened beforehand, and even sort of the changes that came in to sort of wind those back a little bit. I think consulting with a wider range of people was always going to get you more opinions and sort of come to a better conclusion, and maybe change a few policies in ways that might not have occurred otherwise. So I think whilst the board has done quite a good job, I think just a bit more consultation with sort of a wider range of people would always be good.
Okay, cool. What we're going to do now is move more specifically into your own policy statement. So what would you say your overall policy priority is, if you could just pick one general area?
Yeah.
Because I see that you have a bunch of things on your statement.
Yeah, so I think crystallizing my statement down to one area is quite hard, but I would probably say the focus and like the vibe, if you will, of what I'm trying to achieve is really the best sort of student experience possible for people, both in the short run and the long run, and sort of like that university life being the best it can be for everybody. And why I think that's the case is that I think, obviously, looking at the different splits of my policy statement, there are things that are probably a lot more short term. So that's looking at things like coronavirus responses, of course, like that's probably going to be more relevant now than it might be later. But I also think that improving things like clubs and societies, like the logistics for execs and the experiences there, is incredibly important. But also campus culture, they all kind of link together, right? Like they're all a key part of someone's experience at university. And I think what that kind of needs to focus on is that experience for everybody, and making sure that your experience outside of the classroom makes you want to sort of come back to university and continue to be engaged in like the social side of it. Because ultimately, I think university, whilst you come out of it with a degree, is in itself, it's a life experience. And I think making that the best for people relies inherently on a strong USU. And I think a USU that provides and sort of backs and fosters all of those things is going to be the best for making sure students get the most out of their experiences.
You've noted in your policy statement that the USU should be about, and this is quoting, ideas but not ideology. Could you elaborate a little bit on that statement?
Yeah, so kind of I was alluding to this a bit earlier. What I think the board being sort of politicized in a bad way might look like is where candidates are sort of, as they kind of, some are in the status quo, pre-selected by factions, and in some ways either softly or hardly beholden to sort of the ideas or views of those factions, and sort of not able to make decisions in the best interests of the USU on their own basis. And what I kind of think that looks like is people being a little bit overly committed to ideology. And I think it's important to just like sort of draw a distinction between ideology and like ideas or values, in that what I think ideologies often look like are sort of more narrativistic, teleological ideas of things that should be followed regardless, and sort of applied as a blanket statement. Whereas I think what's more important, and what the USU specifically as sort of like more of a service providing, inclusive, dynamic, culture-based society or like group should do, is take a more pragmatic approach and apply ideas and values on like more of a case-by-case basis. So what I think that means is, rather than taking sort of a full-blown, like I said, sort of narrative. So for example, probably not applied to the USU, but things like a free market ideology is kind of a blanket statement, whereas commitments to ideas like freedom or like things like that, liberty, would sort of be values. And I think that if you commit fully to an ideology and impart that on like most of your decisions, you're going to not make good pragmatic decisions. So for example, taking that analogy, if you commit entirely to free marketism, you might like neglect the effect on the environment, right? And that's not a good thing. Whereas if you apply values of like, you know, freedom or like whatever, and you can still have like an ear to other values, right? So I think what's important is you have people taking ideas and values and imparting that to their board decisions, rather than necessarily taking ideology too far. Like rather than running on like a left-wing platform, I think it's probably better to run on like specific like left-wing values or certain policy positions that kind of can help you out there. And I think just coming back quickly to that idea of like being beholden to different factions as well, I think generally, even if it's sort of like a more of a consultative sort of role that a faction might play on ideas, I think that's going to be detrimental, because I think a board director should be elected on their sort of own merit and their own sort of, like I say in my statement, ideas for what the union should look like. And I think even if it's sort of a non-binding role, but even more so when it is a binding role, that's always going to be somewhat problematic and impart ideas and policies for the board that probably aren't necessarily going to be in the best interests of all students. So what I think is important, just summing up, is that essentially ideas and values can be applied on a pragmatic basis without necessarily resorting to sort of tokenistic ideological sort of statements.
Right. Maddie?
So just kind of like leaping off from that, in terms of like ideas, ideology, obviously we've already kind of like talked about the Ramsey Center. I'm kind of curious. So obviously in 2018, Salk hosted Bettina Arndt on campus for a talk, which was very controversial. And kind of in the process of the Women's Collective organizing protests against that, I'm aware that like a number of students wrote to the USU essentially to complain about the hosting of the event, which is also something that happens in relation to clubs such as like Life Choices. How, in your capacity as a board director, would you respond were that to happen again? Were Salk, for example, to invite probably not Bettina, but someone similar onto campus, and there were complaints raised about that, how would you kind of respond?
Yeah, so I think it would be important to look at the specifics of the event at hand. I'll think it's probably more informative if I sort of analogize based off the whole Bettina situation. I think it's important that the USU fosters an environment that is inclusive. So I think that would like initially tend towards people who felt like Bettina's presence on campus wasn't a good thing. I think the firstly consideration should probably be lent to sort of that idea and why that might be the case. But secondly, I think the USU should be somewhat reticent to outright stop events like that from happening. I think that's probably true for a number of reasons. Firstly, I think the Bettina Arndt event specifically, I think much more attention was drawn to that and much more sort of publicity was given to that by the fact that people wanted it to sort of not happen. And by sort of the ensuing things that did happen. So for example, at the protest that happened, a lot of that footage sort of went onto the news. And I think that necessarily the involvement of the USU sort of saying, no, this event can't go ahead, would probably draw a lot more attention to that and draw a lot more attention to sort of the things that are specifically being discussed. So for example, in this case, to Bettina Arndt herself. And I think that was probably not going to be a good thing if all of the concerns to do with Bettina Arndt were going to be like considered to be true. I think secondly, in terms of that event itself, again, I think the best way to combat that would also then be something that should be up for consideration, right? Whether the best way to deal with the issues would be to ban the event or to sort of let it go on and deal with it in that scope. And I think the latter would probably have been true. And I think specifically in terms of Bettina Arndt, because that event was sort of like a live streamed online event, and it was like an event where anybody could theoretically go to, I think the best way to sort of deal with that was going to be to sort of go to the event and engage with it a little bit. And I know that could be argued to sort of be lending credence to it or whatever, but I think the best and most effective way of combating the ideas that Bettina Arndt had, if they were to be like disagreed with, was someone could have gone to that event and sort of got up and asked a question and sort of debated that. And I think in that, like Bettina Arndt isn't someone like Ben Shapiro who's going to post like a Bettina Arndt destroys USyd student video online and get much more publicity. Like having seen that video, she was honestly, in my opinion, quite underwhelming and like wrong on a lot of issues. And I think it was like quite easy to point that out. I think in that example specifically, the USU could have maybe organized something or made some like comments saying, you know, this event is happening. You know, there's an opportunity for you to go and disagree and go and sort of put your ideas out there and deal with it in that way. It was probably going to be more effective in combating those issues anyway. So I think the USU should probably always, again, in summary, be hesitant to outright stop things from happening. And I think you should take it always on like more of a pragmatic basis based on what the event itself looked like. And taking the example of Bettina Arndt, I think the USU, like rightly, by not stopping it, I guess, did the right thing because I think other avenues were available to deal with it that were probably more effective.
Cool. It's a very thorough answer. So I guess kind of like moving back into policy again. Many of your policies seem to be kind of focused on improving existing efforts of the USU, such as improved consultation with CNS executives and reformed funding. What specific innovations will you bring to the USU board?
Yeah, so I think firstly, the innovations are going to be quite focused around the situation we're in right now, that is coronavirus. Like we've talked about, I think like considering the whole new situation of things that are like online, I think supporting the transition for executives in clubs and students themselves through things that the USU can kind of help with, like training. Like I know the USU already does training for people like treasurers. I think that sort of thing can be expanded or like kind of made a new thing to help these online transitions. I also think, like we said earlier, taking more stances on things is something that can like be innovated and sort of happen. I think, again, in terms of what I would sort of bring that's sort of innovative, I think it looks like things like increased student input on decisions. So for example, new food outlets that can possibly come in. I think we don't necessarily have an incredible amount of student consultation in that area. And I think kind of that would kind of translate to a whole wide range of things, not just sort of food outlets, but I think in like specifics right now, that would be a great way to innovate. I also think that just looking at having consulted with students at satellite campuses like the Con, I think innovating in the sense that kind of having them more engaged and more involved with sort of the wider UCIT experience is going to be a good thing, and sort of getting some of the benefits that the USU could help provide for other students provided for them. So for example, what that looks like is bringing back / improving campus charter buses. So from the Con to the campus to make sure that they can be involved in clubs and societies. Things like the USU, whilst it has great things like Incubate, right, that like helps tech startups or other startups, helping arts-based students who probably don't have the same sort of investment in that, get things like industry projects or work experience in that area. I think the USU can do things like that. I think innovating and just kind of making sure, again, in this time of coronavirus, that we can adjust and be innovative in the way that we deal with our current sort of projects and experiences, and making sure they can still be viable into the future.
So you spoke just then about the Con. One part of your policy statement we thought was fairly interesting was the fact that you've kind of packaged together the Con and the colleges.
Yep.
What makes them similar in a way that you think you can deal with them similarly?
So I think just in terms of like pure logistics, in terms of packaging them together, I think it was kind of done to like represent the fact that there are certain groups on campus that don't generally get too much recognition in terms of like USU policy. And I think that they were kind of linked in that sense, and that it kind of showed that I was going to be a board candidate that could potentially represent all types of students. So whilst I have a section on international students because they have very distinct sort of ideas that affect them, and like mentioning the Con and colleges was a way to sort of show that like the USU board, while even though I'm not a student from the Con nor a college student, in kind of keeping with the theme of like increased consultation, increased sort of input from all groups of students, I could kind of take their ideas on board and sort of put them like into a policy position. I think honestly, like putting them together on a policy statement is kind of purely to show like that they're kind of in that sense, linked as groups that generally might be ignored by other candidates.
Do you think there's a lack of engagement with the USU from the colleges in general?
I think we've had improvements in that area recently. So for example, Katie getting on board, I know she's quite like a big figure in the whole college scene. I think that's been a good thing. I think in terms of like college engagement with the USU, I think unfortunately in the past, the historic trend from people at the colleges is that they're much less invested and much less likely to get out and vote in physical elections, at least, when there's not a candidate who's actively sort of pushing for the interests of college students specifically, just because it's not like a key part of their life. Like student politics seems to be something that like is kind of had sort of a disconnect with that group. And I think making sure that all sort of board directors are aware of that potential disconnect and sort of focusing and prioritizing some of their interests as well means that if there were any issues in terms of engagement, that they can be sorted out. And yeah, I think that's how it's best done.
Cool. Maddie?
So sorry to just dip you back into politics again.
Yeah.
But so the USU regulations state that directors shall, and I'm just going to like quote from the regulations here.
I know where this is going.
Yeah, sorry. Inform USU members and the broader community of the detrimental effect of voluntary student unionism. Yep. Campaign against VSU in all of its forms during state or federal elections if it arises as an issue. And work with other student organizations to fight BSU in all of its forms on state campus and a national level.
Yep.
So obviously, you know, there's kind of like a little bit of a tension there between that and then you being a member of the Liberal Party. What would you do if this became an election issue?
So I think the tension doesn't necessarily arise because I think thankfully as a member of the Liberal Party, I was able to have like my own views on certain issues and sort of put out my own perspective on those issues without necessarily being beholden to the Liberal Party. I think similarly, if it came up at an election, which I don't think it will, just considering the whole time frame, I would be more than happy and more than able to campaign against that specific policy and say, like whatever in terms of the election itself, but like obviously voluntary student unionism, I would be willing to campaign against that. Whether or not that looked like actively campaigning on the issue itself, or whether or not that looked like attempting to change like wider policy views within the Liberal Party or whatever, I think obviously noting that is like part of the board director's sort of duty statement, that would be something that A, I would kind of like have to do, but B, also something that I wouldn't be against doing just in general.
Right. So would you say then that you are broadly like against voluntary student unionism?
So I think, especially in the context of the USU, having strong engagement with students and the union is going to be incredibly beneficial for those students. So I think that necessarily any sort of policy position that detriments that is probably not going to be a good thing. I think in terms of like a wider dichotomy between voluntary student unionism and like the alternative, I think it would ultimately depend on like how you characterize voluntary student unionism and how it kind of worked. I think luckily the USU is in a position where, especially with things like free access, its like effects are somewhat mitigated. I think it kind of depends how I was going to be seeing that manifesting. I think the USU is in a great position right now, despite the sort of situation in terms of like wider voluntary student unionism policy, because it's managed to sort of get back to levels of like above $30 million worth of revenue. It's in like a considerably strong position. And I think that's due to like the benefits of like past boards and past board policy and engagement with students. So I think it ultimately depends on the situation at hand, which I think is kind of a theme with most of my policy positions in terms of the board, right? Like it's important to look at things pragmatically, consider the context in which it's operating. And especially in the case of what we're talking about now, considering the context is the USU, I think it ultimately would depend on like how any policy position changes would manifest on the union itself, whether or not I would like actively get out and support them.
Cool. And so your Privatize the SRC campaign was, like, as we said previously, satirical.
Yeah.
But some of the ideologies behind that campaign seem to me to be a little bit different to what you're expressing now. Mm-hmm. What's changed with your attitude towards Stupol?
I would say nothing has changed with my attitude towards Stupol. I think in terms of like why I ran that campaign or why we sort of decided that would be funny, I think what it did was a few things. I think firstly, it had the potential to sort of engage people with Stupol who otherwise might not be engaged. And whilst I appreciate the nature of that engagement might at first be with things like, sort of laughing and having fun, I think it potentially gave them an avenue to sort of actually be more invested in general. I also think like on a purely practical level, what it did was if people were willing to get out and vote for Privatize, they would be like at the booth anyway and probably considered like voting for more legitimate candidates underneath or having a say in like the presidential election, for example. But I also think what it did was it was purely just to let people have fun during the SRC season. I think the SRC season, like looking at USID rants or talking to your friends, to people who aren't engaged in Stupol was like not a good thing, right? People don't like necessarily being harassed on Eastern Avenue, no matter how good that cause was going to be. So I think what Privatize kind of did was provide like some laughs and provide a good time for people during that sort of time. I think my attitude to student politics was never one that was like, it's not important. I think it was one of making sure people were more aware of it in like a more positive light. And hopefully that would like flow on in future to seeing maybe they could have some impact.
Yeah. And how attached to the ideology of Privatize would you say you are? Despite it being satirical, it obviously kind of, express some, for example, defund Honi. What would you say your kind of relationship to that is?
I would say that was just entirely a joke. I think what was funny about it, and I think you kind of can appreciate it, noticing that you're kind of laughing, is that it played up a lot of stereotypes. It played up a lot of like anti-Stupol stereotypes and like corporate whatever stereotypes you'd associate with privatizing things. I think like just going way too far with that was funny. Like PwC presents Honi Soit was like so ridiculous that no one would hopefully take it seriously. I wouldn't say that I was attached to that ideology any more than satirical people like The Chaser are attached to things that they do.
Okay, cool. And just to continue a little bit with the student politics questions. So Sulk has in recent years kind of had a bit more of a hands-off approach when it comes to Stupol, particularly the union board. What's kind of changed this year?
Oh, I think it's solely because I'm not running with Salk at all. I think in terms of being an independent, I understand that there's like that stigma around like liberals and independents and like lib dependents. And like, I kind of get why that might be the case. And I think in the past, people have run purely pragmatically as independents. I think I'm not doing that, like, quite frankly. I'm not running with Salk supporting me. Whilst I'm sure people in Salk might get behind me, I'm sure they might vote for me. I'm not running like with Salk managing my campaign or involved in my campaign in that capacity. For example, Alex running my campaign is running my campaign as my friend, and he's running as a former Switch Roots campaigner, for example. Other people on my team are former members of NLS, former campaigners for NLS, former Unity campaigners. I think I've managed to, luckily, and I'm really grateful for the amount of people who have said that they're really keen to get behind my campaign, managed to like get a legitimately independent, wide-ranging view base campaign going. So I think whilst Salk might be, you know, hesitant to do Stu poll, I'm not running with Salk or on behalf of Salk at all. So I guess that kind of explains that for you.
Yeah, we noticed that Alex Baird was on the Zoom information session. Is he a part of your campaign?
I think Alex Baird is involved in, I think he agreed that he'll help out, maybe get some friends along in the future. He's not involved in terms of like a planning, design, anything like that.
Okay, cool. Chuy, do you have any other questions? Chuy, you're muted.
Just one more question, probably.
Yeah.
Do you think the fact that there's 2 Liberal candidates in the race this year means there's less of a chance either of you will get up, or do you think there's going to be tensions there?
In terms of tensions, I don't think at all. I think me and Nick get along well. I think we've had a lot of good chats about the selection, and everything seems to be really good there. In terms of electoral viability, I don't think there will be that much of an effect either. I think historically, the Liberal sort of vote hasn't necessarily been a huge proportion of Stu poll anyway. But I think even if it was, neither of us are necessarily appealing to that sort of voter base anyway. I think Nick, as SAS president, is probably focusing mainly on that sort of voter base as general. And I'm appealing to, well, obviously trying to appeal to some art students, appealing to another like wide range of people who aren't necessarily going to be like voting on the basis of like A, like they're a liberal, or B, like that's their general ideology. And I assume that insofar as my policies are probably what I hope to get me elected anyway in my personal capacity, like I guess I'm sort of competing against 9 other people as well. And I think that's probably where like the issues like and competitiveness will come about, not necessarily just me and Nick.
Are you going to be preferencing him then? If
I haven't made any decisions in terms of preferences as of yet. I'm still talking to all the candidates. And I think I'll make a preference deal in the end with the people that I think best align with my visions for what's good for the board and what's good for the USU in general. And I think, obviously, I've said before that I'd love to work with Nick, having had brief chats with him. We've had sort of similar ideas in that vein, but I wouldn't lock anything in yet, and nothing has been confirmed yet.
Okay, cool. That's all I have to ask.
Is there anything that you wanted to add, Ben?
Not specifically, no. Just say thank you for having me on.
Cool. All right. Thank you as well.
Cool.
Thanks so much.
You said you were free to make the quiz, right? No problems there?
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Well, thanks for coming.
Cool. Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
All right. See ya.
See ya.